I used to think cardio was enough. 30 minutes on the treadmill, few times a week, heart rate up, some sweat, done, box checked, healthy, right? Wrong. And not just a little wrong. The science on this over the last 10, 15 years has basically flipped the whole picture upside down. Cardio alone, even really good cardio, is not enough to protect your heart, your brain, your hormones, or your lifespan. And today I want to walk you through exactly why. Not opinions, not gym bro theory, actual peer-reviewed data, some of it recent, some of it honestly shocking, even to people who've been in this field a long time. This is not a video telling you to stop doing cardio. Cardio is good, cardio is important, but if it's the only thing you're doing, if you think a good VO2 max and a low resting heart rate means you're covered, the data says you're missing something huge, something that, if left unaddressed, is quietly working against you every single year you get older. By the end of this, you're going to understand what's actually happening inside your muscles, your mitochondria, your hormones, and your nervous system when you train. You're going to understand why the people who live the longest, healthiest lives are not the ones running marathons. And you're going to know exactly what to change starting tomorrow, not next month. Tomorrow, let's get into it. So let's start with where this idea even came from. Cardio is king. It's not crazy that we believe this. For decades, the public health message was simple. Move your body, get your heart rate up, protect your cardiovascular system. And that message wasn't wrong exactly. It was just incomplete. Here's the thing about cardiovascular exercise. It does something real. It improves what's called VO2 max. That's the maximum amount of oxygen your body can use during intense exercise. And VO2 max, it turns out, might be one of the single best predictors we have of how long you're going to live. There was a massive study, over 122,000 patients, published in JAMA Network Open back in 2018. Researchers looked at cardiorespiratory fitness and all-cause mortality. And what they found was kind of stunning. People in the lowest fitness category had a risk of death that was dramatically higher than people in the highest category. We're talking multiple times higher. Higher than smoking, higher than diabetes, higher than heart disease itself in some of the comparisons. So naturally, the conclusion a lot of people drew was, okay, cardio is the thing. Get your VO2 max up, you're set. And I get why. It's a clean story, but here's where it gets complicated and where most people, understandably, stop reading past the headline. VO2 max isn't just a cardio number, it's a whole body number. Your VO2 max depends on your heart's ability to pump blood, yes, but it also depends on how much muscle mass you have to actually use that oxygen. It depends on mitochondrial density inside your muscle fibers, the tiny structures that turn oxygen into usable energy, and it depends on your muscles' capacity to extract oxygen from the blood once it arrives. You can have a fantastic heart and lungs and still have a mediocre VO2 max if your muscle tissue can't use the oxygen once it gets there. And that muscle tissue, how much of it you have, how metabolically active it is, that's not something cardio builds. That's resistance training's job. So already, right at the foundation, we've got a problem with the just do cardio story. The very metric that predicts longevity so well is partly a muscle metric, not purely a heart and lungs metric. Before we move on, I want to address something a lot of dedicated runners bring up when they hear this. But my VO2 max is amazing. Doesn't that prove I'm covered? Here's the subtlety. There's a difference between VO2 max, the ceiling of how much oxygen you can use, and running economy, which is how efficiently you use oxygen at a given pace. Elite runners often have fantastic running economy, meaning they use less oxygen to sustain a given speed, partly because of years of neuromuscular adaptation specific to that movement pattern. But, and this is important, running economy is a highly specific adaptation. It doesn't transfer to general strength, to your ability to get up off the floor quickly in your 70s, to your bone density in your hips and spine, or to how much muscle mass you're carrying into your later decades. You can be extraordinarily efficient at running and still be, in the terms we care about for long-term health span, under-muscled. These are genuinely separate adaptations governed by different training stimuli. That's really the core of what this whole video is about. Interestingly, there's actually decent evidence that adding resistance training improves running economy itself. A number of studies on distance runners have found that adding heavy strength work or plyometrics without any additional running volume, improved economy, and even race times likely through improved tendon stiffness and more efficient force transfer with each stride. So even if performance is your only goal and longevity isn't on your mind at all, strength training isn't competing with your cardio goals. It's often quietly supporting them. Now let's talk about what actually happens if cardio is your only form of exercise, because this is where things get, honestly, a little alarming, especially as we age. Starting around age 30, most people begin to lose muscle mass. This is called sarcopenia when it becomes clinically significant, though the process starts long before it's diagnosable. Research published in the Journal of Applied Physiology and elsewhere suggests the average adult loses somewhere between 3 and 8% of muscle mass per decade after 30, and that rate accelerates after age 60. Cardio does not stop this process. You can run 5 miles a day, every day, and still lose muscle mass over the years because running, especially chronic, steady state running doesn't provide the mechanical tension and the loading stimulus your muscle fibers need to maintain their size and strength. In fact, in some cases, especially with very high volumes of endurance training without adequate protein or recovery, you can see a slight net loss of lean tissue over time. There's also something specific happening at the fiber type level that I think is worth understanding. Your muscles are made up of a mix of fiber types broadly: slow twitch fibers, which are fatigue resistant and heavily used in endurance activity, and fast twitch fibers, which generate more force but fatigue more quickly, and which are recruited primarily during heavy resistance work. Age-related muscle loss appears to disproportionately affect fast twitch fibers. And chronic cardio, because it primarily recruits and trains slow twitch fibers, does very little to protect the fast twitch fibers you're losing the fastest. This is part of why you can be a lifelong runner with genuinely impressive endurance and still notice in your 50s or 60s that your explosive strength, your ability to catch yourself if you trip or to stand up quickly from a low chair, has quietly deteriorated. It's not a contradiction. It's exactly what the physiology would predict. Why does all of this matter so much? Let's go through it piece by piece. Here's something that I think more people need to understand, and it changes how you think about muscle entirely. Muscle is not just tissue that moves your skeleton around. Muscle is an endocrine organ. It secretes hormone-like signaling molecules called myokines directly into your bloodstream when it contracts under load. These myokines do things like reduce systemic inflammation, improve insulin sensitivity, support brain health, and even seem to have anti-tumor properties in some research models. When you resistance train, you are not just getting stronger, you're triggering a hormonal cascade that touches nearly every system in your body. Steady state cardio produces some of this effect too, don't get me wrong. But the myokine response to resistance training, particularly to compound heavy load movements, appears to be more robust for certain markers, especially ones tied to muscle growth signaling like IGF-1 and mechanogrowth factor. So when your only form of movement is cardio, you're essentially running one hormonal program and skipping another one almost entirely. And the one you're skipping happens to be deeply tied to metabolic health, to bone density, and this is the part that surprises people, to brain health. Let's talk about the brain for a second, because this is where I think the cardio is enough story really starts to fall apart for a lot of people, especially anyone thinking long-term about cognitive health. We know aerobic exercise increases something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Think of BDNF like fertilizer for your neurons. It supports the growth of new connections, and it's been linked in multiple studies to better memory and reduced risk of cognitive decline. That's real, and that's a great reason to keep doing your cardio. But resistance training has its own separate cognitive benefit, one that cardio does not replicate. A number of studies now, including randomized controlled trials in older adults, have shown that resistance training specifically improves executive function, your ability to plan, focus, and make decisions in ways that seem at least partly independent from the aerobic pathway. Some researchers think this is tied to improved insulin sensitivity in the brain. Others think it's related to increased IGF-1 crossing the blood-brain barrier. The mechanism is still being worked out, but the effect across multiple studies now keeps showing up. So if you're doing cardio and skipping strength work, you're likely getting real benefits for one arm of brain health and leaving a whole separate arm completely untouched. Okay, let's get into what I think is the most important part of this whole conversation, because I promised you real data, not vibes. So let's look at what the research actually shows about resistance training and long-term survival. There's a study published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, a meta-analysis pooling data across multiple cohorts that looked at strength training and all-cause mortality. The finding, people who did resistance training regularly had a meaningfully lower risk of dying from any cause compared to people who did none. And this effect held up even after adjusting for whether people also did aerobic exercise. In other words, strength training predicted longevity on its own, independent of cardio. Some of the research suggests the biggest benefit shows up at relatively modest doses, something like 30 to 60 minutes of resistance training per week, not hours and hours. That's an encouraging finding because it means this isn't about becoming a bodybuilder. It's about giving your body a stimulus it's currently, for most people, not getting at all. Now, here's a specific number that I think really drives this home: grip strength. It sounds almost too simple to matter. But multiple large cohort studies, including one published in The Lancet with data from 17 countries, found that grip strength was a stronger predictor of cardiovascular death and all-cause mortality than systolic blood pressure. Let that sit for a second. Grip strength, a proxy for total body muscle quality, outperformed blood pressure, one of the most well-established cardiovascular risk factors we have, as a predictor of death. That is not a small finding. That's the kind of finding that should genuinely change how we think about fitness. Why would this be true? A few working theories. Muscle mass acts as a metabolic reserve, a buffer against illness, injury, and hospitalization. When you get sick or injured, you draw down muscle tissue for energy and repair. People with more muscle mass have more reserve to draw from and tend to recover better and faster. People with less muscle, even if their cardiovascular fitness looks fine on paper, have less of that buffer. So an illness that a muscular person recovers from in 2 weeks might hospitalize or even kill someone with very low muscle mass, particularly at older ages. I want to talk about bones for a minute because this connects directly, and it's something almost nobody brings up in these conversations. Bone is living tissue. It responds to mechanical load the same way muscle does through a process called Wolff's Law, which basically says bone remodels itself in response to the forces placed on it. Weight-bearing, high-impact, and resistance-based movement stimulate osteoblasts, the cells that build new bone. Steady-state, low-impact cardio, like cycling or swimming, provides comparatively little of this stimulus. This matters enormously as we age, particularly for women post-menopause, when estrogen decline accelerates bone loss. Studies have shown resistance training, especially loaded progressive resistance training, can meaningfully slow or even partially reverse age-related bone density loss. Cardio, especially non-weight-bearing cardio, simply doesn't provide the same mechanical signal. So think about the compounding effect here. Lower bone density plus lower muscle mass plus reduced balance and coordination, which resistance training also improves through neuromuscular adaptation, creates a much higher risk of falls and much more catastrophic outcomes when falls happen. A hip fracture in an older adult with low muscle and bone reserves is a very different and much more dangerous event than the same fall in someone who's been strength training for years. Let's talk hormones, because this is another place where cardio and resistance training diverge sharply. Resistance training, particularly compound heavy load movements like squats, deadlifts, presses, and rows, produces an acute rise in testosterone and growth hormone in the hours following a session. This effect is more pronounced with resistance training than with steady-state aerobic exercise. Now, an important nuance here, because I don't want to overstate this, the acute post-workout hormone spike is real, but its long-term significance is actually debated in the literature. Some researchers think chronic training adaptations like increased muscle mass and improved receptor sensitivity matter more than the short-term spike itself. So I'm not going to tell you that lifting weights gives you some permanently elevated testosterone level just from acute spikes. That would be an overstatement of the evidence. What we can say with more confidence, chronic resistance training is associated with better insulin sensitivity, better glucose disposal, and improved body composition, more muscle, less visceral fat, and all three of those factors independently support healthier long-term hormone profiles, including testosterone in men and a more favorable metabolic environment in women navigating perimenopause and menopause. Meanwhile, excessive chronic cardio, and I want to be precise here, I'm talking about very high volumes, not your average 30-minute jog, has in some studies been associated with elevated cortisol, and in extreme endurance athletes, even reduced testosterone. This doesn't mean cardio is bad. It means more is not always better, and that the body's stress response system doesn't distinguish perfectly between healthy exercise stress and excessive exercise stress once you cross a certain threshold. Now, I do want to give cardio its due because I don't want this video to be interpreted as cardio doesn't matter. That would be scientifically wrong and honestly a little irresponsible given everything we know about cardiovascular disease being the leading cause of death worldwide. There are two broad categories worth understanding. Zone 2 training that's lower intensity, where you can still hold a conversation roughly 60 to 70% of max heart rate and higher intensity intervals, sometimes called HIIT. Zone 2 training appears to specifically improve mitochondrial density and efficiency, essentially teaching your muscle cells to become better at using fat as fuel and clearing lactate more efficiently. This has real metabolic benefits, and some researchers, notably in exercise physiology labs studying elite endurance athletes, consider it foundational to overall metabolic health. High-intensity intervals, on the other hand, seem to produce faster improvements in VO2 max itself and appear particularly effective at improving cardiac output, literally how much blood your heart can pump per beat. There's a well-known protocol out of Norway, sometimes called the 4x4 method, 4 minutes of hard effort, 4 minutes of recovery, repeated 4 times. That's been studied extensively in both healthy populations and cardiac rehabilitation patients, with notably strong improvements in VO2 max. The honest, nuanced answer is you probably want both. Some zone 2 for the mitochondrial and metabolic benefits, some higher intensity work for cardiac output, and VO2 max improvements. But, and this is the whole point of this video, neither one replaces resistance training. They exist on a completely separate axis of adaptation. You're not choosing between cardio types instead of strength training. You're choosing a well-rounded program that includes all of it. There's one more piece of the metabolic puzzle worth mentioning because it comes up constantly in questions I get, and it's directly relevant to anyone thinking about body composition and long-term weight management, not just performance. It's called EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, sometimes nicknamed the afterburn effect. Essentially, after a bout of intense exercise, your body continues burning calories at an elevated rate for some time afterward as it works to restore oxygen levels, clear metabolic byproducts, and repair tissue. Research comparing resistance training and steady-state cardio generally finds that resistance training, particularly higher intensity resistance training with shorter rest periods, produces a more pronounced and longer lasting EPOC effect than steady-state aerobic exercise at a similar duration. This doesn't mean resistance training burns dramatically more total calories in a single day. The difference is often modest. But combined with the simple fact that muscle tissue itself has a higher resting metabolic cost than fat tissue, meaning more muscle mass slightly raises your baseline calorie expenditure, even at rest, you start to see how resistance training contributes to metabolic health through a completely different mechanism than cardio does. This matters most for people managing weight over the long term. A pattern researchers have observed repeatedly: people who lose weight through diet and cardio alone without resistance training tend to lose a meaningful proportion of that weight as muscle, not just fat. That's a problem because it means the metabolic rate drops more than necessary, which is part of why so many people find weight regain so common after cardio and diet-only weight loss. Adding resistance training during a weight loss phase specifically helps preserve lean mass, protecting your metabolic rate even as the scale goes down. Now, some of you are probably wondering, okay, but if I do both cardio and resistance training, don't they interfere with each other? This is actually a real, well-studied phenomenon called the interference effect, and I want to address it honestly because the answer is more nuanced than a lot of fitness content suggests. The interference effect refers to research showing that when endurance and resistance training are performed too closely together or in very high volumes simultaneously, strength and hypertrophy gains can be somewhat blunted compared to resistance training alone. The proposed mechanism involves competing cellular signaling pathways, the AMPK pathway activated by endurance work, and the mTOR pathway that drives muscle protein synthesis appear to partially inhibit one another when triggered close together. Now, here's the nuance that matters for basically everyone watching this who is not a competitive athlete trying to optimize the last 5% of performance. For most recreational lifters and everyday exercisers, the interference effect is modest and can largely be managed with smart programming. Separating your cardio and resistance sessions by several hours or doing them on different days appears to substantially reduce the effect. Also, lower intensity zone 2 cardio appears to interfere less than very high volume, high intensity endurance work. So this isn't a reason to avoid combining the two. It's a reason to be a little bit thoughtful about how you sequence your training week, which I'll get into in the practical protocol section. I want to add one more layer here because none of what we've discussed works in isolation. Resistance training creates a stimulus, microscopic damage to muscle fibers that then get repaired stronger than before. That repair process happens predominantly during sleep, particularly during deep, slow-wave sleep when growth hormone release peaks. If you're doing everything right, lifting, eating enough protein, keeping your cardio dialed in, but you're chronically sleeping 5 or 6 hours a night, you are meaningfully blunting the adaptive response to all of it. Studies restricting sleep in people undergoing resistance training programs have shown reduced strength gains and impaired recovery markers compared to well-rested control groups. Sleep isn't a separate wellness category from your training. It's the mechanism through which your training actually produces results. Similarly, recovery between sessions matters more than people think. Training the same muscle groups with inadequate rest, especially as you increase load and intensity, can blunt gains and increase injury risk. Most recreational lifters do well with 48 hours minimum between sessions targeting the same muscle groups, though this varies by individual and by training experience. Let me paint a picture because I think this is where the science really lands for people. Picture two 55-year-olds. Person A has run consistently for 20 years, great VO, 2 max, resting heart rate in the 50s. On paper, by traditional cardio metrics, this person looks like the picture of fitness. Person B does a mix, some zone 2 cardio, 2 to 3 resistance training sessions a week, focused on compound movements. Their VO2 max is good, not necessarily as elite as person A's, but solid. Now, fast forward 10 years, person A, despite the excellent cardiovascular numbers, has lost a meaningful amount of muscle mass because running doesn't build or preserve it the way loaded resistance training does. Their bone density has quietly declined. Their balance and coordination, which depend heavily on strength and neuromuscular control, have deteriorated more than person B's. If person A gets sick or has surgery or takes a bad fall, their metabolic and structural reserve to bounce back is lower. Person B, meanwhile, has maintained more muscle mass, better bone density, and a nervous system that's more practiced at generating force and controlling movement under load. Their cardiovascular fitness, while maybe not record-setting, is more than sufficient for a long, functional, independent life. This is not a hypothetical. This is exactly the pattern researchers are seeing in longitudinal cohort studies tracking fitness modality and outcomes over decades. Okay, let's get concrete. This is the part where I tell you exactly what to change starting this week. First, and I cannot stress this enough, if you are currently doing zero resistance training, that is the single highest leverage change you can make. Not adding more cardio, adding any resistance training at all. The research suggests meaningful benefits start showing up at around 2 sessions per week, focused on major muscle groups, using loads that are genuinely challenging, meaning you're getting close to failure or close to it, on your working sets. You don't need 5 days a week in the gym. 2 well-structured sessions, hitting your legs, back, chest, shoulders, and core, is enough to start seeing real changes in muscle mass, bone density, and metabolic markers within a matter of months. Second, prioritize compound movements. Squats, deadlifts or hip hinges, presses, rows, pull-ups, or lat pull-downs. These movements recruit the most muscle mass per exercise, which means the most hormonal and metabolic bang for your training time. Isolation exercises have their place, but if you're time constrained, compound lifts should form the backbone of your sessions. Third, keep your cardio, but be intentional about the type and the dose. A rough, evidence-informed starting point, 3 to 4 sessions per week, mostly zone 2, that conversational pace we talked about, with maybe one higher intensity interval session mixed in. If your joints and recovery allow for it, this gives you the mitochondrial and metabolic benefits of zone 2, along with the cardiac output benefits of higher intensity work without excessive volume that risks the interference effect or overtraining. Fourth, sequence your week to minimize interference. If you're doing cardio and resistance training on the same day, do resistance training first when you're fresher and can generate more force, or separate the sessions by several hours. If your schedule allows, alternating days, resistance one day, cardio the next, is a clean, simple way to avoid most of the interference effect entirely. Fifth, and this is easy to overlook, protein intake matters enormously here. Building and maintaining muscle requires adequate protein, and research generally supports somewhere in the range of 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day for people engaged in regular resistance training, though individual needs vary. Cardio alone, without adequate protein, will not build or preserve the muscle tissue we've spent this whole video talking about. Sixth, think about progression. Muscle and bone respond to progressive overload, gradually increasing the demand you place on them over time, whether that's more weight, more reps, or more difficult variations of a movement. If you're doing the same weight on the same exercises month after month, you'll get some initial benefit, but you'll plateau. A simple approach: try to add a small amount of weight or 1 or 2 reps every week or 2, as long as your form stays solid. When you can no longer do that safely, that's a sign to deload for a week or reassess your program. Seventh, don't neglect your lower body, even if you're mostly interested in general health rather than aesthetics. The muscles in your legs and glutes are the largest muscle groups in your body, and they're the ones most directly tied to functional independence later in life, your ability to get up from a chair, climb stairs, or catch your balance if you stumble. Squats, lunges, step-ups, and hip hinges deserve a central place in your program, not an afterthought at the end when you're tired. Eighth, warm up properly, especially as you get older or if you're newer to resistance training. A few minutes of light cardio followed by lighter warm-up sets of your working exercises reduces injury risk and improves performance on your heavier sets. This is a small time investment with a meaningful safety payoff. Let me quickly address a few things people often ask when they hear this kind of information. I'm over 60. Is it too late to start? The evidence here is genuinely encouraging. Multiple studies, including trials with participants in their 80s and 90s, have shown meaningful strength and muscle mass gains from resistance training programs started later in life. It is essentially never too late for the body to respond positively to appropriate resistance training, though starting weights and progression should be more conservative, and medical clearance is especially important in this group. I only have 20 minutes twice a week. Is that even worth it? Yes. The research on minimal effective dose suggests even brief, well-structured resistance sessions focusing on compound movements produce meaningful benefits, especially compared to doing nothing. 20 focused minutes twice a week hitting the major muscle groups with challenging loads is far better than an ambitious plan you never actually execute. Do I need a gym, or can I do this at home? You don't strictly need a gym. Body weight progressions, resistance bands, and even household objects can provide adequate loading stimulus, particularly for beginners. That said, as you get stronger, access to free weights or machines makes continued progression considerably easier, simply because it's harder to keep making body weight exercises harder indefinitely. What about pain or old injuries? This is exactly the kind of situation where working with a physical therapist or a knowledgeable trainer, at least for an initial assessment, is worth the investment. Many old injuries actually benefit from carefully progressed resistance training, since strengthening the muscles around a previously injured joint often improves stability and reduces pain, but the specifics matter enormously, and generic advice isn't a substitute for individual assessment. Medical disclaimer here. If you have any existing cardiovascular conditions, joint issues, or are new to exercise after a long period of inactivity, please talk to your doctor before starting any new resistance or high-intensity cardio program. Some of what I've described, particularly higher intensity interval work, should be approached carefully and possibly under medical guidance if you have known heart disease or are otherwise at elevated cardiovascular risk. This is general information, not personalized medical advice. I want to pause here and make sure I don't accidentally leave you with the wrong impression, because cardiovascular disease remains the leading cause of death globally, and nothing in this video should be read as downplaying that. Aerobic exercise does things that resistance training on its own doesn't replicate nearly as well. It improves endothelial function, the health of the lining of your blood vessels. It lowers resting blood pressure in many people. It improves lipid profiles, particularly HDL cholesterol and triglycerides, and it directly trains your heart muscle itself to pump more efficiently, increasing stroke volume. Resistance training does produce some of these benefits too, particularly around blood pressure and insulin sensitivity. But the evidence base for aerobic exercise, specifically protecting against heart attack and stroke, is deep, consistent, and goes back decades. If you had to choose only one, which again is not the choice I'm asking you to make, cardio would still be the more essential piece for protecting against the single most common cause of death. So this is genuinely an and, not an or. The research doesn't suggest replacing cardio with resistance training. It suggests that treating cardio as sufficient on its own leaves a second, largely separate set of health outcomes: muscular, skeletal, hormonal, and part of cognitive health, comparatively unaddressed. Both systems matter. Both have distinct, well-documented mechanisms. And the good news is that a well-designed weekly routine really doesn't need to sacrifice one for the other. Now, in the interest of intellectual honesty, let's talk about the downsides and the limitations of everything I've just told you, because no protocol is free of trade-offs, and I think you deserve the full picture, not just the highlight reel. Resistance training carries injury risk, particularly if form is poor, load progression is too aggressive, or recovery is inadequate. This risk is real and shouldn't be dismissed. The evidence suggests working with a qualified coach, at least initially, meaningfully reduces this risk, especially for people new to lifting. Time is a real constraint for a lot of people. Adding resistance training on top of an already full schedule that includes cardio is a genuine logistical challenge, and I'd rather you do 2 well-executed resistance sessions per week consistently than an ambitious 5-day program you abandon after 3 weeks. There's also individual variation that matters. Age, existing joint health, hormonal status, and genetics all influence how quickly someone responds to resistance training and how much load they can safely tolerate. The general principles I've described apply broadly across the population, but your specific starting point should be tailored to your circumstances, ideally with input from a physical therapist or trainer if you have existing injuries or conditions. And finally, I want to be honest that some of the mechanistic research I've cited, particularly around myokines, hormone signaling, and some of the longevity mechanisms, is still an active, evolving area of science. The correlational data on muscle mass, grip strength, and mortality is quite robust. Some of the deeper why explanations are still being refined as research continues. I'll also add a note on causality, because it's easy to gloss over in a video like this. A lot of the strongest data connecting muscle mass and grip strength to mortality comes from observational cohort studies, not randomized controlled trials. That means there's always a possibility that some of the association reflects reverse causation. People who are already sicker or already experiencing early undiagnosed decline may naturally have lower muscle mass and grip strength as a downstream symptom, rather than the muscle loss itself being the primary driver of their risk. Researchers try to account for this statistically, adjusting for existing disease and other confounders, and the associations generally hold up even after these adjustments. But it's intellectually honest to acknowledge that observational data, however large and consistent, is not quite the same standard of evidence as a randomized trial. Fortunately, the intervention studies, we do have actual resistance training trials measuring changes in strength, bone density, and metabolic markers are broadly consistent with the observational picture, which strengthens confidence in the overall conclusion, even if no single study proves it beyond all doubt. One more area worth touching on before we close, because it comes up in the comments every time I talk about exercise. Mental health, aerobic exercise has a large, well-replicated body of evidence behind it for reducing symptoms of anxiety and depression, likely through multiple pathways, increased BDNF, changes in serotonin and norepinephrine signaling, and reduced systemic inflammation, which is increasingly linked to depressive symptoms in the research. What's less widely known is that resistance training has its own independently replicated body of evidence for reducing anxiety and depressive symptoms in some meta-analyses showing effect sizes comparable to aerobic exercise. Interestingly, these benefits appear even when the resistance training doesn't produce significant changes in strength or muscle mass, suggesting the mental health benefit may work through a partly separate mechanism, possibly related to the sense of mastery and self-efficacy that comes from progressively handling more weight over time, alongside the shared biological pathways with aerobic exercise. For anyone struggling with anxiety or low mood, this is genuinely good news. It means you have more than one tool. If running or cycling doesn't appeal to you or isn't accessible because of joint issues or other limitations, resistance training is not a lesser substitute for your mental health. It's a legitimate, independently evidenced path to the same kind of benefit. And for many people, doing both provides a broader, more resilient set of tools than relying on either one alone. I'll also say, because it matters for accuracy, exercise is a powerful adjunct for mental health, but it is not a replacement for professional treatment in moderate to severe anxiety or depression. If you're dealing with persistent symptoms, please also talk to a qualified mental health professional. Movement can be part of the treatment plan. It generally shouldn't be the entire plan on its own. So let's bring this all the way back to where we started. I used to think cardio was enough. Heart rate up, some sweat, box checked. What the science actually shows is that cardiovascular fitness and muscular fitness are two separate, only partially overlapping systems in your body. Cardio protects your heart and lungs and improves certain metabolic and cognitive markers. Resistance training protects your muscle mass, your bone density, your hormonal environment, and a separate arm of your cognitive function, and independently predicts how long and how well you're going to live. Neither one replaces the other. If you're someone who's been a dedicated runner or cyclist for years and you've never really touched a barbell or a set of dumbbells, I'd encourage you gently but seriously to reconsider that. Not to abandon what you love, but to add 2 sessions a week of real challenging resistance training and give your body 10, 15 years to compound that benefit. The data suggests it might be one of the most important changes you make for your long-term health span, not just your lifespan. Start small. 2 sessions this week. Compound movements. Challenging weight. Keep your cardio. Just don't let it be the only thing. I think about it this way now. Your cardiovascular system and your muscular system are like 2 separate accounts you're paying into for your future self. Cardio pays into the account that protects your heart, your lungs, and a slice of your brain health. Resistance training pays into the account that protects your independence, your ability to carry your own groceries, get off the floor without help, keep your bones from becoming brittle, and hold on to the muscle that quietly regulates so much of your metabolic health. You cannot withdraw from an account you never paid into. I spent years only funding one of those accounts, thinking it covered both. It doesn't. And the data on this has only gotten stronger and more consistent over the last decade, not weaker. This isn't a trend. It's not a fad rebranding of lifting is good for you. It's a genuinely different, well-documented physiological system that deserves its own dedicated attention in your weekly routine. If you take away one thing from this video, let it be this. Fitness is not one dial you turn up or down. It's at least 2 separate dials, your cardiovascular capacity and your muscular and skeletal reserve, and long-term health, the kind that lets you stay strong, mobile, and independent well into your 80s and beyond, requires turning up both of them deliberately over years. You don't need to overhaul your life this week. You need 2 sessions, compound lifts, Progressive, patient effort. Keep doing your cardio. It's genuinely important. Just stop assuming it's covering ground that physiologically it was never designed to cover. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.